Duke football enters yet another new era with Manny Diaz coming to take over for Mike Elko. Mike Elko obviously takes the Texas A&M job, and now Duke looks to enter another new era with Diaz coming to town. Diaz gets another chance at being a head coach, another new chance at being a head coach in the ACC, and we'll see how this one goes compared to his first time in Miami. Before we get started in this deep dive, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the video. It goes a long way in helping me out with this series, with the channel, to keep it going. I really appreciate all the support you guys have shown over the years. This deep dive series has been really fun, but it's not possible without you. So again, make sure you're subscribed, make sure you like the video, and let's dive into the Duke Blue Devils in 2024. We'll start with the transfer portal. One of the obvious things about coaching changes in general, is that there's going to be additions and losses via the transfer portal. You're going to expect players to come and go. You're going to expect roster turnover. And that was not an exception for Duke this year. With Mike Elko departing, not a lot of players followed him in terms of really, I don't think many, if any, did went to Texas A&M because it's just a different level of play from Duke to Texas A&M. That being said, there were still plenty of players that departed, which wasn't surprising. Quarterback Riley Leonard obviously heads to Notre Dame. RJ Oben's gone. That was a huge loss. Jordan Waters departs, Brandon Johnson. You lost a number of players that made a big time impact. And we're going to see that when we go over the depth chart today. We're going to go over the positions and look at what happens when you lose some key players. That being said, I think Diaz did a pretty good job of bringing in talent to help his roster, but I think maybe the level of of starting ability might be a little bit of a concern. We'll see what happens though. You brought in guys with a lot of potential, so it's kind of just a matter of getting them on the field and seeing what they can do. Nobody embodies that more than Malik Murphy. That was one of the bigger additions for Duke, was getting Malik Murphy to come from Texas to Duke to be the starter. He will compete obviously for that role, but it'll be interesting to see, is he actually still worth the hype, or are we going to see a learning curve right off the bat? We will see with that. An underrated addition was probably Javon Harvey from Old Dominion. That's definitely a guy to keep an eye on in terms of passing attack, because again, this passing attack definitely needs to take a step forward, and a lot of that was going to hinge on Murphy and the receivers. We'll start with Malik Murphy and the running backs. Malik Murphy is expected to be the starting quarterback. I think a lot of people have that opinion. That being said, you have two guys behind him that are going to compete. Grayson Loftus played significant time last year, threw for over 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns. Henry Belvin the fourth also played. Not as consistent, not as successful as Loftus, but he still did play. So it is a three-man competition, probably well into fall camp. It probably is a two-man competition until everybody expects Murphy to pull away. That's going to be interesting to watch, because this offense, again, was, I think, efficient at times, but they need to find ways to move the ball through the air a little bit better, a little bit more efficiently. So that's something to keep an eye on there. Murphy's going to play a big role. He's going to show that. I mean, when you look at what Malik Murphy did at Texas last year, I think a lot of people expected greatness right off the bat. And I think we do that in college football a little bit too much. We just, oh, this guy's super talented. He's going to figure it out right off the bat. We do a lot of projecting just based off of their 5-star, 4-star rating. We go off of, what we see in limited clips. And Malik Murphy kind of fell into that category. Everybody expected, oh, well, Quinn Ewers isn't in. That's fine, because Malik Murphy is just the next man up. And I don't think that happens as much as we'd like to think it does. But Malik Murphy definitely has the talent to be a good player for Duke and to be a good player in the ACC. He just has to put it all together. And he joins an offense that has the talent to be a well-balanced offense. The rushing attack, despite losing quite a bit of talent to the transfer portal and graduation, returns a number of players that are really exciting if you're a Duke fan. Jaquez Moore will lead the way, 674 yards and 6 touchdowns last year in what was a crowded backfield. So he will definitely get more touches. We'll see what he can do in an elevated workload. Other guys behind him, there's plenty of talent to work in here. Al Wooten comes in from Mercer. He'll be a contributor. And same with Star Thomas coming from New Mexico State, just a recent addition for Duke. He'll be fun to watch as well. Karan Boyd is a player that I think this staff is high on after the spring practices. So someone who could figure in as well could find his way into that rotation. The Russian attack should still be a decent group. I think that if you're looking for this offense to improve, the rushing attack is probably not going to be that group just because they are a little bit more proven than the passing attack. If the passing attack takes a step forward, then I think the rushing attack can also elevate as well. But I don't think that they're going to get as high as in terms of the number of spots they jump as if the passing attack takes a step forward. And that passing attack, here's the thing, it's not, I feel like I say this for a lot of teams, but it's not a lack of talent. And there's plenty of talent on this roster, but who's going to be the go-to guy? Because when you look at some of these guys in terms of frame. They have some big body players. Nicky Dalman at tight end, Eli Pankel at wide receiver. Now, missed the entire year last year with an injury. So we'll see if he can get back to 100%. But those are guys who have frames that really stand out. But you have to be able to turn that in production. Now, other guys that aren't necessarily as big, but will probably fill those starting roles. Jordan Moore is one of them. 6 foot, 195 pounds, 835 yards last year, 8 touchdowns, a third team all ACC according to College Football Network. Someone who can be a reliable player. He's been that for the last couple of years for Duke, and he'll be the same thing for this new staff, for this new offense, for whoever throws in the football. Jordan Moore is not a concern. After that is really where things get interesting because Amir Haggins could be one of those guys, but only caught, he only had 260 yards last year. So this is someone who's caught 30 passes. He averaged 8.7 yards per catch. That's not exactly an explosive player in terms of production, but it's also limited. So you're not exactly sure what you're going to get from him. You have a number of other players that could step up. Javon Harvey, we talked about him. He could be one of those guys. John Tavis Robertson is another one. I think that you have options. It's just a matter of putting that potential into production. Talk about that a lot. Putting potential into production. You can have all the potential you want. Malik Murphy's a perfect example of that. But if you don't put it into production, it doesn't really matter how talented you are if you don't do anything with it. So that's where this group is going to be. There's a lot of potential in this group. There's a lot of excitement surrounding this group, but it has to be a group that takes a step forward. You cannot finish 112th and to expect to compete in the ACC. This is, even though it's a conference that's taken a little bit of a step back, this is still a tough conference to win. It's still a tough conference to compete in, and it's not going to be a cakewalk for any team that's struggling to throw the football. This is a group that has plenty of talent to make that happen, but you have to find ways to get open. Because when you look at the offensive line too, this is where that wide receiver group and the tight ends need to step up because this is an inexperienced offensive line, and there's a lot of new faces coming in from the transfer portal. When you look at what this group could be, there's going to be a lot of changes, and there are some people that could play different positions. Brian Parker's probably one of them. Could play center, could move out to tackle. We'll see, but he's inexperienced. Only has 4 games of experience under his belt. The other two guys on the right side, Tony Boggs and Matt Craycraft, again, inexperienced is really the best way to explain it. And then after that, you look at it, there's transfers galore. And when you bring in transfers, you're kind of taking a gamble. And when you have this many transfers, that means that some of these guys probably aren't going to work out, and that could leave your offensive line exposed. So this is probably the biggest concern if you're a Duke fan. That being said, there are some exciting players that could take a step forward. Parker is interesting because he can play those two different positions. We'll see what happens with that. Jack Purcell comes in from Penn. You have Bruno Fina coming from UCLA. Mike Barr comes in from Lafayette. Zachary Franks comes in from Northwestern. You have transfers that have talent, but who's going to be the starter? Who's going to be in that rotation? And can that offensive line play a big enough role or make a big enough impact where you're headed in the right direction instead of taking steps back? Because there are questions about this offense in terms of the skill positions, but there's also talent there. The offensive line has to obviously figure their stuff out too. They have to find a way to play at a high level, gel quickly, because this season is going to jump on them really quick. And it can't be on the defense to do everything, although Manny Diaz knows how to coach a good defense. And that's what makes this group really exciting, despite the fact that they lost quite a bit of talent. Now, when you look at the defensive line, There is a ton of excitement when you look at this talent. This is a group that is not necessarily the most experienced, but they're also not inexperienced either. So you're kind of in the middle of that there, and you're just waiting for a lot of these guys to be unleashed. Vincent Anthony Jr. is one of those guys. 6'6", 246 pounds, four tackles for loss last year. Someone who I think can be really explosive for this defensive line. Someone who can be a much better player in terms of being more of a contributor than he was last year. So we will see what he brings to the table. And I think there's a lot of good things to be had, a lot of good things to be seen from him. Ryan Smith is another player as well, and Wesley Williams at on the edge, I think will be part of that rotation. Michael Reese is a name to keep an eye on. In on the interior is really where things get interesting because you have Will Seiler coming in from Penn, could be part of that rotation, but Aaron Hall and Kenny Charles to me stand out the most. Should be the starters for this defense. Kenny Charles comes in from Liberty and didn't have the best season last year, but 2 years ago we saw what he was capable of doing. We saw that he was a standout player for the Liberty Flames, and I expect him to be a very good contributor for Duke and for Manny Diaz defense. So that's going to be a fun player to watch as well. You have good talent up front, and you also have talent behind him. These are probably two of the more underrated players in college football. When you look at Trey Freeman and Nick Morris Jr., I think that these are two guys that really could be standouts. And Duke's kind of done that in the past. They've had some underrated linebackers that have stood out. When you look at some of the players that they've produced over the last few years, Duke's defense continues flying under the radar. And it's one of those teams. There are a lot of teams in college football that you don't know a lot about these guys until they have a big year. And then unfortunately for Duke, they either graduate or they hit the transfer portal and they go to another school. Trey Freeman and Nick Morris Jr. had good years. Freeman recorded 106 tackles, 5 tackles for loss. Morris had 61 tackles. So these guys know what they're doing. They're experienced. They know how to get guys into position, and they should feel comfortable with what they see up front. It's just going to be a matter of, yeah, Alex Howard comes in and after playing for Youngstown State, transfers to Texas A&M, and then changes his mind. Ozzie Nichols comes in from Princeton. You're looking at two guys that I think are going to have to learn about the elevated level of play. But if they can do that, they're good depth pieces that'll be really fun to watch if you're a Duke fan, if you're excited about what Manny Diaz brings to the table. The secondary, honestly, even with some of the players they lost, should still be a really fun group. This is a group that finished 41st. Again, Mike Elko did such a good job with getting the right guys in position, the right guys on his roster, and putting the right guys on the field. And Manny Diaz should do the same defensively. And if he can do it offensively as well, then you're in good hands. Chandler Rivers is one of the better cornerbacks that you're going to see in college football. He's still very underrated. Again, Duke's just full of underrated players that step up. And I think when you look at what Duke did last year, there was a lot of surprises that we weren't. There was a lot to be shocked about because you didn't expect Elko to take this group to a certain level, and they pulled off some surprises last year. They were able to put people in their place because no one really gave them the time of day at times. I think a lot of people, probably including myself, didn't expect a ton from this group. An 8-5 season was obviously very impressive, and the secondary was a big reason why. Chandler Rivers will play a big role. He's a very good player who probably won't get tested as much this year because people know what he's capable of, but he's still someone that's going to lead the way for this secondary. At the safety position, it's going to be really interesting. Jalen Stinson is a big time playmaker for this team. Terry Moore is the same. You're going to see a very good combination between those two. It's players that can be disruptive and play near the line of scrimmage, but also can play deep and take away the deep game for that opposing passing attack. Joshua Pickett's going to be an interesting player opposite of Chandler Rivers. We'll see what happens with him. And then in terms of the nickelback position, Cameron Bergeron is going to be a player that will be an X factor for this secondary. And how he plays could determine a lot about what how much success this group has. Now, the depth part of this is where you probably get a little bit more concerned, but there is talent. I think that Trayshawn Devon is going to be a rotational player. You get him involved as much as possible. I know that the staff really likes what they got in him. So that's something to keep an eye on. And after that, you have some inexperienced players. So you have some interesting talent that could play bigger roles in 2024. When you look at strengths and concerns, I don't really like saying weaknesses because we don't really know what the weakness is until you actually play. Concerns kind of looks at what you might think is going to be a weakness. Strengths to me, wide receiver. There is talent there. There is the ability to play at a high level, but you're going to have to figure out what is this group capable of doing, which is why receiver depth is a concern. So yeah, receiver depth, you're going to have to find a way to do that. Defensive tackle to me, defensive line probably is going to be a good group for Duke, and linebacker probably is going to be the same thing. The secondary also is a strength to me. The secondary has plenty of talent. The secondary has a lot to like, and they have plenty of players that are going to step up and play at a high level. Concerns to me, quarterback. Quarterback's going to be a concern because Riley Leonard was, while he was hurt and inconsistent because of those injuries, quarterback is a concern. You don't know who's going to be the guy. Even if it is Malik Murphy, you still have to see it before you believe it. And that's going to be a big determining factor of how successful the offense is. The offensive line also is a concern. If you are not careful, this could get ugly pretty quick because you have a ton of inexperience on that offensive line. But I really like the potential of that group. I really like the potential of quarterback as well. So that will be something to keep an eye on there. When you look at the schedule, over under for Duke right now is 6 wins. And when you look at the schedule, and if you go at it and a optimistic point of view and a pessimistic point of view, there's a lot to like either way. The first 4 games, you can feel pretty optimistic, even if you're looking at it from a pessimistic point of view. Now, Elon is going to be a win. The trip to Northwestern is where it depends on how you're looking at it. So I think that Duke is still um, a good team. I think that this new coaching staff has a lot of things to work out. So you could be 1-1 after week 2. Northwestern was a surprise team last year, and they have plenty to work out themselves, but that's a group that could surprise Duke and find a way to win. Home at UConn will be a win at Middle Tennessee. I really like when Power Five or whatever we're calling it now, these bigger teams go to the group of five and play a road game. Playing at Middle Tennessee is a really random game, but I like it. And Duke should win that game. It doesn't matter that it's on the road. So we'll see what happens there. But you're looking at a potential 4-0 start. Now, from there is where things get really interesting because it kind of dictates what kind of season you have, but you could be 4-0. I think there is a realistic situation where Duke is 4-0 heading into the North Carolina game. Now, that's a rivalry game, and I think that North Carolina is in a better position. So I think that North Carolina wins that game. Georgia Tech is on the rise. I think that Georgia Tech probably wins that game. Florida State is going to win that game as well. SMU is interesting because SMU, we don't really know what we're going to get from them in the ACC, but SMU is definitely not a team to mess with at this point in the season. We will know how good Duke's offense is, or how good it or how bad it is, how much it's struggling. So that determines quite a bit about what this team is going to look like. At Miami is going to be a loss, and NC State probably is going to be a loss. NC State's so tough, especially at home. Virginia Tech is much better. That's probably going to be a loss as well. But again, we're at the end of the season. A lot can change from there. At Wake Forest, I think that's going to be a really interesting game for a Duke. So ceiling to me for this team, 8-4. The floor is 4-8. I think that even if you lose the Northwestern game, there's no way you lose those other 3 games. You're 3-1 at worst to me when you're going through that first month and our first 4 games. So Manny Diaz has a lot to build on in terms of momentum. There's plenty of reason to be excited. It's just a matter of, do you have to temper those expectations when you start getting an ACC play, or is this going to be a team that picks up where they left off? I don't expect another 8-5 season from Duke, but I think that if you can still make it back to a bowl game, that's a good way to bring the Manny Diaz era into Duke. And I think that this is going to be a team that is tough to beat. a team that plays really well defensively, and they just have to figure out what's going on offense. And if they do that, you're going to see a lot of success for the Duke Blue Devils in 2024.